Hello, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is Massachusetts TNC's webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, and influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Alison Bowden, TNC and Massachusetts Director of Rivers, Coasts, and Oceans, and your host for today. Here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and globally using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and the planet. We have an exciting program for you today on a nature-based solution called Living Shorelines. We know nature can play a huge role in protecting communities while also providing ecosystem benefits. Living shorelines absorb wave energy, reducing the potential for erosion and providing protection to landward areas from flooding. They also provide habitat to a range of creatures and may be more adaptable to changing conditions than traditional gray infrastructure like seawalls. And TNC has many active living shoreline projects here in New England, which we'll be talking about today, along with some other projects from around the world. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about our guests. Steve Kirk is the Coastal Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts. A former oyster farmer and U.S. Coast Guard licensed captain, Steve's focus at TNC is advancing the policy and practice of shellfish aquaculture, nearshore habitat restoration, and living shorelines to improve coastal ecosystems and support the communities that rely on them. Steve has a BA in geography from the University of Vermont and a Master in Marine Affairs from the University of Rhode Island. Eric Roberts is the Climate Risk and Resilience Program Manager for TNC's Global Climate Change team, where he's responsible for advancing strategies and projects that conserve and restore coastal and other natural habitats for the protection they provide to people against the physical impacts of severe weather and climate change. He holds a Master of Science with a focus on conservation ecology and ecosystem management from the University of Michigan's School of Natural Resources in the Environment, and a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Management from Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs. As you think of questions for Steve and Eric, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thanks again so much for joining today. Let's dive in. Over to you, Steve and Eric.
Well, thank you, Allison, for the introduction and for inviting me to join today and share some of the global team's work. By the end of this presentation, I hope everyone walks away with an understanding of why nature-based solutions for coastal resilience, such as living shorelines, and why insurance for nature are gaining interest among the public and private sectors in New England and around the world. But before I go there, Lauren, if you'll go to the next slide, I just want to set the context for why we are doing some of this work and share a few statistics. So in the past 10 years, 83% of disasters triggered by natural hazards were caused by extreme weather and climate-related events. And over that same time span, around 1.7 billion people were affected by climate and weather-related disasters, mostly in low-income countries. You might know that 2020 was one of the warmest years on record, and nearly 50 million people dealt with flooding, droughts, storms, and wildfires in 2020 alone. According to the United Nations, there are approximately 600 million people, or roughly 10% of the world's population, who live in coastal areas that are less than 10 meters above sea level. And in the United States alone, there are approximately 127 million people living in coastal areas. That's about 40% of the US population, at least according to 2014 population data. So both at home and abroad, coastal populations and their livelihoods are threatened by storms. They're threatened by coastal flooding and erosion, and increasingly by sea level rise. Some of the most vulnerable people who don't have access to resources to adapt to climate change are and will be disproportionately affected by climate change and sea level rise in the future. So it's really important that we find ways to address some of these risks. Luckily, we do have one powerful way to take up this climate challenge and to build coastal resilience, and that's to use nature-based solutions to minimize some of the impacts. Lauren, next slide, please. So nature-based solutions are essentially the sustainable management, conservation, and restoration of ecosystems to reduce risks to communities. For instance, we might use coral reefs or mangrove ecosystems or even salt marshes to reduce wave energy before it reaches the coastline. And by reducing that wave energy, we minimize the severity of coastal erosion and flooding that can occur. And with this graphic on the screen, you'll see that not only do these ecosystems provide very important protective services to coastal communities, but they also provide nutrition for millions of people around the world, and they're the source of livelihoods for a lot of people as well. And next slide, Lauren. So our goal is to make the case for nature as a risk reduction mechanism. And on the global team, the Global Tackle Climate Change team where I work now, we do this via two main bodies of work. One is around insurance for nature, and the other is working with humanitarian organizations. Both of these areas of work are very much focused on science. So TNC has been working in the field of assessing the protective benefits of nature for 12 or 15 years. And we've been using that science to influence policy at the international, the national, and the state levels. And we often end up working with local communities as well, whether that's to pilot projects or to replicate successful pilot projects from elsewhere. We're always looking for new approaches to find solutions that can protect our coastal communities from severe weather and climate change. And with the global team in particular, we're focused on the innovative climate finance mechanisms and how insurance can be used as a mechanism to provide more funding for restoration of our coastal ecosystems. And next slide. So on your screen now, these are three examples of the kinds of headlines that you might see coming from some of our scientific work. On the left side under the coral reefs, this is a study we released last year with the US Geological Survey, showing the value of flood protection benefits provided by reefs in the US alone. And the one on the far right is particularly interesting because we worked with the insurance industry to assess the protective value of salt marshes in the case of Hurricane Sandy. And the estimate there was that losses from Hurricane Sandy were reduced by 10% or so. And some states with significant amounts of salt marsh, like Maryland or Delaware, they benefited even more, up to about 30%. So these headlines give you a flavor of the potential scale of protection that natural systems can provide right now. And bear in mind that most of these ecosystems have been severely damaged or reduced in years past. We've probably lost somewhere in the range of 50% of all coral reefs. Similarly, 50% of all mangrove coverage around the world. And I've heard in the Northeastern corridor, up to 60% of salt marsh coverage we've lost. Yet these ecosystems are still providing protection, which makes a good solid argument for restoring these ecosystems for the services they provide to our communities. And next slide. So just a quick kind of high level overview of our reef insurance work, really ensuring nature work. All of this is underpinned by our research on how nature can help us to avoid damages from flooding and erosion. And essentially here, what we've done in Quintana Roo, Mexico is placed a parametric insurance policy on about 40 miles of coral reef along 100 miles of coastline. And parametric insurance is a bit different model than you're probably used to. With the indemnity insurance that most of us have on, say, our cars or our homes, et cetera, you have to actually prove the damage and the cost of repair, and then insurance will pay out a portion of that. With parametric insurance, it's a bit reversed, and the payout is based on a measurable parameter. So in this example in Mexico, because it's essentially hurricane insurance, that parameter that is measured and kind of determines when a payout happens is wind speed. So if and when a hurricane comes through that blue polygon that you see on the map, and if it reaches a certain wind speed, the insurance policy pays out immediately. And that actually happened in 2020. This was the first time where, this project was the first insurance for a natural ecosystem in the world. And this payout was the first example of it actually working. So in 2020, $850,000 became available for repair of the reef after the hurricane came through. The quick payout can happen because prior to the development of the insurance policy, we were able to determine the wind speeds that caused damage to the reef and the estimated cost to repair those damages. And we were also able to put in place the capacity to repair those damages quickly after the storm comes through. So in our view, nature is a very valuable asset. It just happens to be a natural asset, and assets we tend to want to protect. So insurance is a very effective way of doing that. Um, creating and really ultimately creating insurance for natural systems is about creating new revenue streams for the repair and restoration of nature after they're damaged, so that we can ensure these ecosystems continue providing the protective services to communities, along with all of the benefits for nature. And next slide, please. So where the work is continuing, we are scaling this reef insurance model from Mexico all around the globe. And we're trying to do that in three main ways. We're scaling geographically, so there are still many reefs around the world. We are looking to try this reef approach in Hawaii, as well as Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, Indonesia, the Philippines, Micronesia, Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Guam. And recently in Hawaii, there was a legislative action passed to explore the use of insurance. So we're really hoping we might be able to do this in Hawaii soon. We're also scaling the context in terms of the risks that could be covered by insurance. So for example, we're investigating whether or not it might be possible to provide an insurance policy against coral bleaching or potentially sedimentation of coral reefs. And finally, we're looking to see if this ensuring nature approach could be carried over to other ecosystems that provide protective benefits. So specifically right now, we're looking at mangrove ecosystems, which are highly effective at attenuating wave energy. They also do a great job at storing carbon. We're about halfway through a feasibility study to look at whether or not we could indeed copy the reef insurance model in Mexico and replicate it with mangroves throughout the broader Caribbean. And next slide, please. So the other side of our global work focuses on engaging humanitarian organizations. So we have this project called the Nature Protects People project. It was funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development and their Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. We're about 2 years into the project. It will actually conclude in 2022. But the goal of this project is to equip disaster risk reduction practitioners, so folks who work at places like the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, and to work with governments at all levels and communities to reduce the impacts of disasters and plan for climate adaptation using nature-based solutions. So we're developing guidance like this guide you see on the screen called the Blue Guide to Coastal Resilience. And we're also developing other tools to integrate nature-based solutions into planning and to build awareness of nature-based solutions. There's a portion of this project that's about developing an app that people can use to identify and help them do their planning with nature-based solutions. And there is a policy component as well, where we're working to integrate nature-based solutions into national level policies. So this work started in Indonesia and Micronesia in the Caribbean, but some of these knowledge products like the Blue Guide to Coastal Resilience are really global and could be applied at many different places. So that's a bit about our global work, and I will turn it over to Steve to talk about how nature-based solutions are being implemented in Massachusetts and in greater New England.
Hey, thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Great setup. And so I'm going to take this chance to sort of downscale the discussion toward our backyard and our region, which will sort of be focused on New England. Eric was pointing out the risk is really when there are these natural disasters and people and infrastructure impacted by those disasters. We certainly in our area have a confluence of a population center near the coast. I think, to remember and sort of the top line takeaway here is that healthy natural coastal habitats provide protection. We know that they provide a lot of services to nature, habitat for other species, improving water quality. But really the important part that we're thinking about in this presentation is their protection power and the ability to reduce flooding, impacts from severe storms. Eric mentioned, that study related to Hurricane Sandy. it was shown that that coastal wetlands provided a value of $625 million in avoided flood damage. So just the very fact that there was a coastal wetland around the infrastructure that was able to absorb water and slow wave energy, that $625 million in avoided flood damage cost was provided because of the existence of that wetland. It's a powerful tool. Next slide, please. So the habitats that Eric referenced, were primarily tropical. Thinking about coral reef and mangroves, we have analogous habitats in our temperate region. I went swimming last weekend. It's still fairly temperate around here right now. But the habitats that we're thinking about and working on our oyster reefs and seagrasses like eelgrass and salt marsh. These are really dynamic habitat types, and they're in dynamic areas. This is like where freshwater meets saltwater. It's the edge of the ocean. It still sort of amazes me when I'm at the water's edge with my family, which is often, and standing right there is the place where the land emerges from the ocean. This is a dynamic location, and that there really is a natural interface and a natural progression, really, from upland to the intertidal to the nearshore area. Next slide. We've built a lot of gray infrastructure. So here, thinking seawalls and riprap and jetties, and really the intention in doing that is to maintain the land's edge and protect the property and infrastructure behind that built infrastructure. There's an unintended consequence that goes along with that, and that's disrupting that natural progression from upland to intertidal to near shore. And really, what I'm alluding to is sediment dynamics. I'm not a geologist, but thinking about erosion. So put yourself in the bathtub and move your hand to create a wave, and what happens when the wave hits the end of the bathtub? It bounces off and the wave comes back at you. And in many cases, a wall can do the same thing. So, wave energy from the ocean coming to the shore hits the wall rather, reflects and deflects the wave energy back toward the shoreline. And maybe the sediment behind the wall isn't directly affected, but look to the edges of that wall. And so basically displacing erosion to places further along the shoreline. Climate change fueled sea level rise, more frequent and severe storm activity, with flooding, and that erosion can be exacerbated. Had we not built right at the water's edge, that dynamic process would likely continue. Think of a coastal bluff that could continue to erode and supply sediment, sand, or dirt and things down to a beach to nourish a beach or a nearby salt marsh, and that's sort of what those habitats need to stay intact. Next slide. So Eric really set it up well, and we need to protect these coastal habitats where they haven't been lost. Referencing some staggering statistics on the loss of that habitat globally, and certainly that those numbers translate to our region in oyster reef and salt marsh for sure. So we as a society, we basically already manage the shoreline. Our aim here at TNC is to expand the use of these nature-based solutions, living shorelines, to manage the shoreline in a way that protects infrastructure and our communities, but we also gain these additional benefits, the habitat, the water quality benefits. And we think we can do that using natural materials that mimic the natural coastal habitat that actually provides the protection. So we're leading a New England-wide project working with partners in our coastal zone management agencies across New England. The project is funded by NOAA, Here you see one of the funded projects that's in Rhode Island, basically, placing some rocks at the, the edge of the shoreline there, and then, laying natural fibers and planting, salt marsh grasses to, in essence, construct a marsh. To maybe step way back right to the beginning, I suppose, a definition of living shoreline, a set of coastal erosion practices ranges from non-structural vegetated, so plants only, to hybrid or hard structures. So we're okay using hard material, think rocks or tree stumps and logs, that sort of thing. But the goal really to address erosion and inundation in a way that improves or protects the ecological condition of the coastline. So referencing that project, the other image on the screen there is, we call it a design profile. It shows the different components of a potential living shoreline project. So all the way, seaward to the right, you see some placement of rock material and natural fibers. Going shoreward, placement of sediment, plantings, and then back up toward the shore side. In our region in New England, there's been a bit of a positive feedback loop. These projects have not been adopted at the same rate here as in other parts of the country. So there's relatively few projects, and that results in scant performance data, like how well do they work? And there really, I think, is some skepticism by property owners, designers, those who would build these, living shoreline projects, and even the regulating and permit review community. But if you want to build a wall, we kind of know how to do that. We've been doing that for decades. Next slide. So, our aim has been to get more projects in the ground and in the water, demonstrate their performance, and spread the word as to their effectiveness. We're also doing, with partners, cutting edge research to understand questions like, what density of vegetation does a marsh need to provide the protective benefits? It's sort of the information that we need to understand the performance and ultimately to drive investment toward protection, restoration, and the construction of these living shorelines. So here are just a couple of examples. Well, I should also say that, it's not like a living shoreline or this set of practices is necessarily a silver bullet. There are siting considerations and different project types that might be suitable in one location over another. Here are a couple of examples. On the top, you see a bluff stabilization project. This is where some natural material has been laid across the sandy, eroding bluff, and then some vegetation to try and hold the sediment in. It's very different than building a concrete wall above the tide line. A really interesting, I think, exciting project type down on the bottom here. We call this a living breakwater. Really, in essence, these are concrete structures that are placed in the intertidal area. And just like the natural habitat that slows wave energy, these reef balls, these concrete structures do just that. They slow the wave energy such that sediment that might be suspended in the water can settle on the shoreward side of the installation. And in fact, a couple of years after the installation of this project, the area behind the shoreward side has raised in elevation by a foot, and marsh grasses, some planted and some have just recruited and just grown naturally into that area. It's we call this a living breakwater because you can see the different species can make use of those concrete structures as providing habitat for fish that can swim through the holes you notice on the screen. Also, there, other species can settle onto the concrete, thinking, animals like oysters and other shellfish, crabs, crustaceans can walk along in between. So I think it's just a really exciting example of a living shoreline, and one that has had a decent amount of success in our region. So I think that's all I've got for now, and maybe I'll pass it back to Allison to see if there are some questions rolling in, and we can have sort of more of an open discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing about these innovative nature-based solutions for coastal resilience. I think we'll continue to see the Living Shoreline strategy make a huge difference, both here locally and around the world. So let's dive into the audience questions. And just as a reminder, as you think of questions for our panelists, please go ahead and enter them into that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We already have some, but we definitely want to have a really engaging conversation with you. So we'd love to answer your questions. So I'll start with one, and Eric, if you want to pop your video on, go right ahead. Awesome. So what's needed to scale the use of these nature-based solutions? These are a good idea. How do we get a lot more of them? And I'll let either one of you take that.
Great. Well, I'm sure Steve will have some other things to add to this, but I think number one on scaling the use of nature-based solutions, we need a greater understanding among a range of stakeholders about the full range of benefits provided by natural ecosystems. That could include, additional science about various ecosystems. It could also include just awareness and understanding of some of the existing science. I think we need to identify some of the barriers and disincentives that create an uneven playing field for nature-based solutions. I think there's a really interesting opportunity maybe to assess and quantify the benefits of hybrid approaches that combine nature-based solutions with traditional infrastructure and potentially extend the life of a traditional infrastructure that's placed farther inshore, that type of work too. And of course, I think funding to continue the development of proof of concept type projects to address some of the gaps in science are all things that are needed to help advance some of this nature-based solutions work.
Anything you want to add to that, Steve?
Yeah, I guess just to I suppose, say it just what Eric said in a slightly different way, just that these, at least the Living Shoreline projects and those that are, being tested and implemented in New England, it's still a relatively new practice here. And so, I think there ultimately needs to be confidence that that they are an effective tool. And so I think Eric really hit on disseminating the information to the people who would likely use it, so that it would become perhaps the first option and not sort of an alternative option. I think I'm hopeful that in years to come, things like seawall and rock revetment become the sort of odd duck out when nature-based solutions become the go-to, and the education to the different stakeholder groups, whether it's property owners, permit reviewers, design installation firms, is critical, and then the money to build them.
Steve, can you say a little bit about some of the challenges that real or perceived? Why aren't living shorelines the norm in New England?
Sure. I mean, there are some, I would say, straight away on environmental factors. We live in New England, different than the Southeast US, in that we have long winters and short growing seasons. So if you're going to plant vegetation, you have less time for it to be really well established before you go into winter. With winter comes ice and scouring that can impact a project just by scouring across an installation. Finally, especially in the Gulf of Maine, maybe less so in southern New England, but we have pretty significant tidal range. Gulf of Maine sees average 10 feet of tide, and so to consider a construction project that can be effective across a wide tide range is another factor. Whereas places like Chesapeake Bay only have a couple feet tide. So I suppose I'll leave it there. Environmental factors is one.
Great. So Eric, there are some questions about the reef insurance, a little bit more about how it works and whether TNC actually does the repairs when the reef is damaged. But there's also a question about why just wind speed. So Michael Marsh asks, why is wind speed the only metric for risk of adverse impact from storms? So can you say a little bit about how the parameters are selected and whether that's always the parameter or if there are different options?
Sure. So to the question about how does the reef insurance work, I'll start with that one and the repairs question. There's really kind of three main components of reef insurance or of insuring nature. There's one is having a funding mechanism that can accept funding streams from public and private and other sources. So in the Mexico example, that funding mechanism is it's a trust fund, and it's managed by a public-private partnership of the government and of NGOs and of municipalities in Quintana Roo, Mexico. The second component that's needed for a reef insurance or insuring nature program is the insurance policy itself, to protect against severe damage and catastrophic losses caused by some randomly occurring type event like hurricanes. And then the third piece is having the capacity to actually repair and restore the reef after damage happens. So in Mexico, what TNC did was we developed damage assessment and repair protocols, and then we trained groups of people and organized them into what are called reef brigades locally. And so there's about 80 people who are trained to actually carry out damage assessment and response planning and implementation after a storm comes through. So TNC is involved in that work, but it's coordinated with many partners locally. You know, when it comes to the question about wind speed as the only metric, you know, it could be potentially different metrics in different circumstances. You know, with coral bleaching, if that's the risk that you're trying to insure against, the metric might be degree heating weeks. But really what you need for the metric is you need a historical amount of data to be able to assess the kind of the probability of when these events may occur. And you also need that data to be collected by a third party independent group. So for example, in Mexico, the wind data that we rely on comes from NOAA. And that way the insurance policy, you know, the insurance company is not trying to influence whether or not the payout occurred based on what they say is the wind speed. TNC or local partners aren't trying to say, well, we measured the wind speed here. You know, we have this third party that can provide that data. But, you know, depending on the type of risk, you may have different metrics, but it needs to be measurable. There needs to be a record of it, and it needs to be able to be monitored by an independent third party.
Great, thank you. Are there examples of doing that in the US, or is that just something that's happening outside the US right now?
So far, there are not examples of insurance for nature yet in the United States, but yeah, we're really hopeful that you know, we might be able to implement this work in Hawaii, and the mangrove insurance work that we're doing right now shows that there might be some good potential to do mangrove insurance in Florida, but we'll see. There's still a lot of work left to do on that feasibility study.
Thanks. So there are a number of questions that sort of relate to the question of sea level rise. We know that the environment is changing and it's changing quickly. So do we think that these projects that we're building are stable enough to withstand sea level rise? Should we be planting things higher? You know, what are we doing in order to factor in that change? Maybe start with Steve on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and you know, a changing environment with higher sea level and where species may exist now, where they will likely exist in the future with higher water levels, it's really important for just simple design of a project. And so, that's I think a component of the sort of passing comment I made around, where to do these kinds of projects. I mean, I think we want to ensure that the habitat that is in existence continues to be, and these habitats like salt marshes have existed for a very long time and through changing environments. And so dealing with things like nutrient pollution to ensure that the existing habitat has the best chance of survival, critical. And then I think it's back to design, and it's sort of in some ways a bit of a time horizon kind of question, like how long do you design a project to be effective for? And I think you sort of asked the same question of a hardened structure. I think this is sort of like I said, a relatively new practice in our region, and some of the same design considerations around where to install hardened infrastructure should be weighed against where to install green infrastructure or nature-based infrastructure. So I think it's, it turns into a case-by-case basis and should certainly go into the planning for a construction type project. I don't know if Eric, do you have other thoughts on that?
I think you covered it. The only thing I might say a slightly different way is that, nature-based solutions have the opportunity to adapt to sea level rise, where, your gray infrastructure, once it's built, it's pretty static. You might be able to do some building up higher of it, but the nature-based solutions, if designed appropriately, they can also adapt pretty easily to sea level rise.
Yeah.
So there's a question about permitting, basically what we would call habitat conversion. So is there any consideration of sort of the trade-offs of anything we do there where there's some habitat there today?
Yeah, I'll take a stab, and I think that gets to a heart of one of the threads of a potential barrier is this regulatory one. And the question is alluding to the fact that, to construct, say, a marsh, you need to put some material into the area that's like underwater. And that area is regulated because it's important for other species. So there are environmental protection laws to ensure that, we don't put parking lots in marshes. Those are good environmental regulations. And yet, we sort of have to go through the same permitting scheme to build a living shoreline type project, which I think is appropriate. And so it's in some ways it's hard for the permit review and regulating community to parse out what they would think could potentially be a good project, ultimately resulting in the removal or the conversion of some of that protected habitat. I think the flip side is that should that permitting scheme and regulatory framework limit the use of nature-based solutions, that it will sort of result in incentivizing or defaulting to using this gray infrastructure out of the area where it's regulated. So you might build a wall that's above the high tide line, let all of the sediment go away through erosion, and then suddenly you have a wall that's right up against the shoreline, ultimately probably damaging that habitat that was intended to be preserved in the first place. It's really complicated, and we're working with that regulating community to try to think, be thoughtful about where potentially a temporary negative impact might be acceptable for an overall benefit to the system.
Thanks. So Eric, since you're working in other parts of the country as well as other parts of the world, maybe you'd like to say something about how we work with the Army Corps and FEMA. So Harriet Resnick asks, have the Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA, and other agencies approved and funded NBS approaches?
I believe that they have. I have not worked on any specific projects that Army Corps has funded, but I do believe that they have worked on nature-based solutions. They have a whole engineering with nature program. And I have not been so involved with that program in the last year or so, but I know that they have done a lot of research and have been producing a lot of great reports and information for people to learn how to use nature for protective purposes. Steve or Allison, you might be able to say a little more about that question.
Sure, actually, I can add a little bit. Yeah, that Army Corps of Engineers Engineering with Nature group is totally focused on nature-based solutions, and they work pretty closely with NOAA. And they actually just put out a new atlas with 60 or 62 case studies from around the world of nature-based solutions in action, creating benefits for people and nature. And there's a project from Massachusetts in there, the Mill River restoration, one of our dam removal projects, actually in there as a global case study. And we've been working pretty closely with FEMA on updating their cost benefit analysis methodology. So the way that FEMA decides what to fund is using this cost benefit. And nature-based solutions have historically had a hard time getting through that just by the way that the method was done. And they recently updated that policy, and now we're thinking about how we can work with them to really deliver results on the ground, particularly with a lot of new federal funding coming. They have a new program that they put out a request for responses for $500 million last fall. So they'll be announcing the awards under that probably sometime this summer, and there'll be another round in the fall. So a lot of money is going to be spent over the next several years on risk reduction. And we really are putting a lot of effort into trying to see that go to nature-based solutions whenever possible. Historically, about 3% of all of that investment has gone to nature-based, and we'd like to see that number change quite a bit. Anything else that you wanted to add there, Steve? Okay, let's see. I've got lots of questions here. I'm getting behind. Someone asked an interesting question about kelp. Let me see if I can find that one. My list is getting long. Do we have kelp projects anywhere? Hearing that kelp is a major ocean purifier. Maybe Steve, you'd like to say something about aquaculture.
Yeah, sure. The kelp question, interesting. As a purifier, I mean, we know that underwater algae species and seagrasses are ecosystem engineers. They're really important to the proper functioning of an ecosystem. And so there's been a sort of a nascent industry around growing kelp, some for, in an aquaculture setting for food and for other products. And in fact, we are working on several different kelp projects. The one sort of closest to us in the Northeast is in Maine. And in fact, we've been working closely with the aquaculture industry, particularly the shellfish industry, to understand how their farms interact with the marine environment. So we're doing a project to see how different species utilize the farm equipment and farm gear in the water. And similarly, a project in Maine is looking at how, once the kelp is growing through the water column, what fish congregate and utilize the species. So trying to really understand the habitat value of kelp when it's grown in an aquaculture setting. A really interesting component of that is just by the nature of kelp growing, it also is a carbon sink. And so there's some evidence that show kelp in an aquaculture setting can sort of buffer against some of the ocean chemistry issues, ocean acidification in particular, that is changing along with climate change. So it's sort of a relatively new area of study for the Conservancy, but an interesting one that sort of crosses boundaries between our providing food and water strategy and our aquaculture team to nature-based solutions, and can growing kelp in our coastal waters, nearshore waters, actually provide some protection benefit, possibly wave attenuation, but also just proper functioning of our coastal ecosystem.
So there's a question here about another question about insurance. Could the insurance approaches that Eric talked about be used for protection where coastal development projects potentially could threaten the health of a bay? Is there a way that insurance could play a role in that?
The way that the insurance products are designed that we've been using, so the reef insurance format, that probably couldn't be used in that instance, because it wouldn't be on a parametric basis. There's no specific measure with long-term data that you can monitor, and there's no third party necessarily collecting that consistent data over time. But in that instance that there's fear from environmental degradation from the development of whatever project it is, the construction companies can actually have insurance for that type of damage. It's more your traditional indemnity type damage insurance, but as the reef insurance model is structured, it wouldn't apply in that situation.
Got it. Thank you. Lots and lots of questions here. I want to make sure I'm getting to all the major themes that folks are asking about. Thank you for your great engagement here. This is really fantastic. So this one's kind of fun. Why do you care about this? Why do you do this? Whoever wants to go first.
I do. I love this. I'm a person of the coast and the water. I always have been. I was really fortunate as a kid to be able to spend time around the water's edge with my family. I feel amazingly fortunate to now do that with my young family. And I've spent not quite a lifetime, but my own lifetime near or on the water, sailing thousands of miles offshore, doing oceanographic research. I own an oyster farm. It's like the place where I feel most at home. And it is, at the same time, awe-inspiring and horrifying, the potential that a no action future to me seems unacceptable, because the coast and our shoreline is so deeply important to me and my family and to so many others, for not just for their recreational opportunities, but for their very existence. What else could be more important?
Steve, you said so many great things that resonate with me. Absolutely. I think for me, I do this work because ultimately I got into environmental work because of public health. I wanted to find ways that I could work in the environment in a way that would improve public health. And so coastal resilience is trying to address one of the biggest challenges we have, climate change, sea level rise, and figuring out how do we do that in a way that's responsible for our environment. But yeah, all those, loving the coastal ecosystems, turning over the shells and seeing what I can find, that was kind of where my passion for the environment came from. And feel really fortunate and lucky to work for TNC to do this type of work.
Beautiful. So can you say a little bit about the evidence that this is sort of a newer set of approaches. What kind of evidence are we seeing? And maybe Steve, you could say a little bit about the where, if somebody wants to go see one of the projects that's underway, where can they look?
Yeah, well, that is a great question. Really thinking about the evidence to the performance, the effectiveness of these projects is one of, I think, the barriers to widespread adoption. Part of the project that I referenced earlier has to do with building that evidence. And so we've worked with our coastal zone management agency partners to develop, Eric deeply involved in this project, to develop monitoring metrics and protocols to try to see how the projects perform from a scientific monitoring perspective across many parameters, not only from the biotic to are the plants surviving, what's there, to the geologic, and does the shoreline move change? Is the intended purpose of the project being met? To really quantify, document, and review that information is something that project that we're working on is aiming to do. So, I think the one example previously, is anecdotal in the fact that you see the waves crashing against those reef balls, and there's been a foot of sediment accretion or buildup behind that. It's like, wow, that's pretty telling. That's a project in Connecticut. I think a place to look is across the coastal zone management CZM website. They're actively involved in our shoreline management. And there are several websites that have sort of a catalog of where these projects are. I'm sure that we'll be able to send out information for like specific locations to be able to go look with your own eyes.
Great. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Eric?
Coastalresilience.org comes to mind as a place where you can find a lot of data on, sea level rise and potential resilience, nature-based solutions and where they might work. And yeah, glad to share some links to resources on some of the insurance work, the pre-feasibility study that we did in Hawaii and Florida on mangrove insurance, and some of the other supporting documents for Mexico as well.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just another resource just to sort of capture it, to make sure that we send it out. A previous project resulted in a report called the State of the Practice. It's sort of taking a snapshot of where are we related to living shorelines in New England. And that is where I pulled the little schematic of a marsh creation project. It's got some interesting visuals in it, some case studies. So it's a decent place to use as a resource for sort of an introduction to this topic also.
And I'll add that the science behind this work really is something that we're investing a lot in, both here in New England and around the world. We just published in Conservation Science and Practice a small case study from 2 projects in the Mystic River watershed here in the Boston area, and have a few more papers in the works. So stay tuned for those. So we're just about out of time, unfortunately, and I'm sorry there are so many questions left, but we'll be doing more webinars. So you can always send us an email as well. But before we wrap up, both Eric and Steve, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I'd just like to say thanks for everybody for joining and for taking interest in this. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about the insurance. Be glad to chat. Thank you.
Yeah, similarly, just thanks for the interest and participation. Glad we had a lot of people and a lot of great questions. I particularly like the, why do we care? What are we doing? Or why are we doing this? It sort of strikes a chord right back to, the why for us, which is always fun. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks to everyone who tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is what makes all of this work possible. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to some of the resources that we talked about today and a recording of this webinar. If you're enjoying our webinars, please share them with your friends. So you can send this recording to your friends and you can watch it again. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on both Facebook and Instagram. You can follow me on Twitter at Alison_Bowden to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming opportunities to connect with us. As always, you can see our upcoming webinars and sign up at nature.org/MA webinars. And our next webinar is on June 3rd at noon. We'll be hearing from Sandy O'Connor and Mark Adams of the National Park Service. In a unique collaboration between the arts and sciences, Sandy and Mark have been working to use art as a means to document the impacts of climate change on Cape Cod. You'll hear from Sandy and Mark about how their partnership came about and how art can be used as a vehicle to enhance environmental protection. You'll also get a first look at Sandy's newest artwork. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.